people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. An unexpected bit of news certainly took me by surprise late yesterday. Boxing scribe Jeff Jeffries tweeted, Maiva Hamadouche will have the chance to avenge her defeat against Delphine Persoon on May 14th in Dubai in the undercard duel of Floyd Mayweather.
What, that thing he's doing on the helipad?
One and the same. I had no idea that there were conversations happening in order to orchestrate a rematch between these two former champions, Maiva Hamadouche of France and Delphine Persoon of Belgium. Unbeknownst to most, these two have locked horns before in what was a slobber knocker, a barn burner of a fight.
This will be a sequel to their initial meeting 7 years ago.
7 years ago, a then unbeaten Maiva Hamadouche traveled to Belgium to challenge Delphine Persoon for what was the green belt, what was the WBC lightweight title, the 135-pound version of that title.
She gave Delphine Persoon hell.
In a way that only Maiva Hamadouche can. But alas, Maiva lost the decision.
7 years ago.
7 years later, the rematch is here, and I'm just going to come right out and say it. I like Maiva Hamadouche to win the fight.
She's 5 years younger than Delphine.
5 years fresher. Delphine Persoon has been in a lot of fights and a lot of wars. Here today, she's 37 years old.
One of the most physically imposing fighters I've ever seen.
Both of them. Certainly two of the more physical, rough and rugged fighters you'll come across anywhere at or around super featherweight.
There's nothing the least bit subtle about both of them.
They are pressure fighters through and through, the both of them. That's what they do, and they're both physically strong pressure fighters, durable pressure fighters. The real difference between them is a slight discrepancy in height and their sweet spots, where they like to operate. Maiva Hamadouche is more of a mid-range to inside puncher, whereas Delphine Persoon,
Her sweet spot's mid-range to outside.
where she's got enough space to straighten out that arm and put something on it.
I wasn't expecting this.
And I had absolutely no interest in Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s next exhibition match set to take place on the helipad over at the Burj Al Arab in Dubai. I had zero interest in that card.
But now I have to watch it.
32-year-old Maiva Hamadouche sports professional record of 22 wins, 2 losses with 18 knockouts. The 37-year-old Delphine Persoon sports professional record of 46 wins, 3 losses with 19 knockouts.
7 years ago, Maiva Hamadouche fought a prime Delphine Persoon.
7 years and several wars later, I favor Maiva Hamadouche to win because Maiva is still now who she was then, but better, more experienced.
She's been training out of Mark Ramsey's gym up there in Canada.
Mark Ramsey, the very accomplished Canadian-based trainer, I wonder if he will be in Maiva's corner once May rolls around. It's a very important fight in spite of this fight not actually being for a world title, an alphabet title, because when these two girls first met, the boxing world, most of it, wasn't familiar with them. They weren't really familiar with Delphine Persoon, not yet, and they weren't familiar with Maiva Hamadouche. So in spite of their fight having been an excellent fight, real slobber knocker, real barn burner, it was a barn burner that flew largely under the radar, as did most good women's bouts back then. The sport has grown since then. It has changed. Fighters have more of a profile and more opportunities. And, now the boxing fans are familiar with Delphine Persoon based on what they saw in the Katie Taylor fights. Now the boxing fans are familiar with Maiva Hamadouche based on what they just saw with Mikaela Mayer.
The second fight has more of a profile than the first fight did.
And given that it's taking place in Dubai on the helipad of the Burj Al Arab, on the undercard of one of Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s exhibition matches,
I'm pretty sure they're going to make more money off this rematch than they did the first fight.
making the effort a worthwhile effort.
As both fighters are almost guaranteed to put forth a more than worthwhile effort.
Delphine Persoon and Maiva Hamadouche are the kind of fighters to leave it all in the ring, leave it all in there, and against each other. What do you think's going to happen?
It's either Delphine Persoon is going to win the rematch like she won the first fight,
Proving that she just has Maiva Hamadouche's number, that the both of them, they are quality pressure fighters, world class, but Delphine Persoon is just a cut above Maiva. It's either Delphine's going to win the rematch and prove that, or Maiva
or Maiva will avenge the loss.
Maiva's going to give Delphine a taste of what she's been working on at Mark Ramsey's Boxing Academy. This rematch, this second fight, unlike the first one, will be fought in neutral terrain for both fighters. The first time out, Maiva had to travel to Delphine's neck of the woods, to Belgium, as Delphine was the then reigning WBC lightweight champion, whereas here and now,
Nobody's got home field advantage.
the gamesmanship of the both of these fighters never fails to disappoint, because the both of these fighters, they're hot potatoes. They're not the kind of fighters that you fight on a whim.
You're opposite the ring, any one of these two. You know you're in for a long night.
Even though Delphine Persoon, in many ways, introduced herself to the world in the both of those Katie Taylor fights, having already been a very accomplished fighter and a very accomplished champion, a lot of people, they were seeing her for the first time in those two Katie Taylor fights. And in spite of increasing her profile, that's part of what made her a hot potato. You don't just fight Delphine Persoon. You don't just fucking fight Delphine Persoon.
She's fucking dangerous.
So is Maiva Hamadouche. She always was. Even if a large number of fight fans weren't aware of that, the fighters themselves and their managers, their trainers, and their promoters, they were.
She's fucking dangerous.
They know that. They've always known that. You don't just fucking fight Maiva Hamadouche.
Since their last outings, I imagine it's been hard for the both of these fighters to get fights.
Because you can't just keep busy with a Delphine Persoon. You can't just keep busy with a Maiva Hamadouche. For any high-profile fighter out there, anywhere at or around 130 and 135 pounds, these are not keep-busy fighters, and fights with them are not keep-busy fights. If you're opposite the ring, either one of these sluggers, you're in for a long night. And I think it's probably been difficult for both Delphine and Maiva to get high-profile fights. So what they opted to do was take each other on. Take each other on for a second time, and I love it.
We'll get into a full fight breakdown as the fight date approaches.
Look for this. Next month, on the 14th. In men's welterweight news, Terrence Crawford communicated this to Errol Spence Jr. Keep my belts warm. I'll be coming to grab them later on this year.
Flame has been reignited.
Interest in the fight between Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford has been reignited in a way that
It hasn't felt palpable for a very long time.
on the other half of the fight seems all but decommissioned due to a horrific car accident. Fights only once in the subsequent 2 years since that car accident. Sits out all of last year due to an eye injury.
The fight starts to feel like the one that got away.
The fight between Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford, that was up until this past weekend when Errol stopped Yordanis Ugas.
Annotations and anecdotes aside, if we stick to the facts, that's what happened.
To that victory, Terrence Crawford himself stated, "Congratulations, great fight. Keep my belts warm. I'll be coming to grab them later on this year." Now, the real fight happens, insisted Terrence Crawford, who presently does not have a fight scheduled. No more talk. No more sides of the street. Let's go.
For a long time, this fight felt like the one that got away.
And I maintain my original position that it never had to take this long. If it's taken this long, it's because that's what Errol Spence Jr. wanted. He wanted to save Terrence Crawford for last.
That's no secret. He said that himself.
So an exercise in critical thinking might leave one so inclined to ask, why save Terrence Crawford for last? Why him?
The fight with Crawford had more of a buzz than the fight with Porter.
Or the fight with Ugas. For the last 3 or 4 years, we haven't been clamoring to see Errol Spence Jr. take on any of those guys. The fight that we wanted, the fight that we asked for, was the Crawford fight. So why save him for last if that's the fight people want to see, not these other guys?
Politics of boxing?
Terrence Crawford only recently parted ways with Top Rank as a promotional outfit. And you could argue that that might have something to do with it. That might be the reason Errol wanted to save him for last. But you know what?
What?
Top Rank being involved didn't stop the Wilder versus Fury rematch from happening. Top Rank wasn't involved for the first fight. Fury jumped into bed with them in between the first fight and the second one. And when he did, that didn't stop the rematch from happening. So how is that an excuse for this?
This not to have happened already.
How is that an excuse?
It isn't. It isn't, and it never was.
This fight could have in fact happened sooner than later, and if it didn't, it's because Errol Spence Jr. didn't want it to. Now, why he didn't want it to? Well, this is a more dangerous fight than a fight with Yordanis Ugas. This is a more dangerous fight than a fight with Sean Porter. This is a more dangerous fight than a fight with Danny Garcia or Mikey Garcia.
That might have something to do with it.
If you fight him before you fight them, you won't make it to them. Not with an unbeaten record and not with those alphabet titles.
It's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
You're not going to change my mind, but look.
Listen.
We've already been all through that. We've already had those conversations and mulled over the necessary talking points to establish this as a reason,
We have.
the reason that the fight hasn't happened yet. We've been all through that. At this point, this past weekend's fight gave this fight the shot in the arm that it needed, because there were a lot of guys like me that lost a lot of trust in Errol Spence Jr., lost faith that he could still be...
For a long time, I thought this guy was damaged goods.
So much so, I actually picked Ugas to beat him. I did. On that premise, on the premise that Errol Spence Jr. had been in a horrific car accident, that he had only fought once in the last 2 years, the subsequent 2 years following that car accident, and that he sat out all of last year due to an eye injury. If the time off has been to his benefit...
If he's not damaged goods and he's fully recuperated...
Riding high, confident, after having stopped Yordenis Ugas in a one-sided contest, a one-sided affair. If what this heralds is Errol Spence Jr.'s clean bill of health, and that he is now who he was then in 2017 when he stopped Cal Brock, if that's what all of this means...
Great, make the fight.
No excuses, no lingering injuries, no politics, no mandatories, and no reason to have to wait for it any longer. Make the fight. This weekend's contest between Errol Spence Jr. and Yordenis Ugas gave the Crawford fight the shot in the arm that it needed, because there were a lot of people questioning Errol Spence Jr.'s physical condition ahead of that fight, as well as the overall interest and commercial value.
The fight is buzzing now.
Errol Spence Jr.'s fans would have you believe that Terence Crawford isn't a good fighter, and he has no value, no commercial value, yet Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Oscar De La Hoya, they want to crash the party. They want to get involved. They want to sign Terence Crawford.
And what, you think they want to sign him because he ain't worth nothing?
Because he ain't got no commercial value. No, it's the opposite. They know the fight is once again buzzing, the fight between him and Errol Spence Jr., and they want a piece of that action. They want to get involved, crash that party. And I'll tell you now what I told you before. Crawford don't need those two guys to make this fight. He don't need them. That's just more hands in the cookie jar. His cookie jar.
If what this past weekend's fight heralds
is a clean bill of health for Errol, that's good news. That's cause for celebration, especially at a time when Terence Crawford's not preoccupied with anything. Errol Spence Jr. is not under any orders to satisfy any mandatories at this time, and he says he wants that fight next, so...
Top Rank's not in the picture anymore.
Make the fight. Because whatever Errol did to
Ugas ain't Crawford.
Make the fight.
Imitations and anecdotes aside,
I didn't trust Errol Spence Jr. to win this weekend's fight due to what I believed were residual injuries, lingering ones, coupled with ring rust, and what I thought would be a more inspired fighter than Yordenis Ugas turned out to be.
I didn't know for sure if he was still a healthy fighter.
If I am to interpret this weekend's contest, Errol Spence Jr.'s triumphant return to action, as a clean bill of health for that fighter, without any lingering injuries that might hamper his performance, I will do so gladly, because car accident or no car accident, I always thought Crawford beat this guy. There's a difference between fighting Ugas and fighting Crawford. Fighting Ugas, at least for me, was contingent upon the physical state of Errol Spence Jr., his health, and how he may have been so affected by the car accident and the time off. That's what that was all about. But if this guy's fine and he's all right and all that stuff that happened in the last 2 years, if none of that is an issue, that's not an issue. Because I thought Crawford would beat this guy before any of that happened.
So make the fucking fight.
Hey, so when I stop him, y'all gonna say he was too weak. Oh my mic. He stayed at 147. Okay. Crazy. What you smoking on?
Finally, in men's heavyweight news, ahead of what is to be this weekend's big heavyweight showdown between domestic rivals Tyson Fury, the reigning champion, and Dillian Whyte, the challenger, the mandatory challenger, Dillian Whyte didn't attend the open media workout ahead of the fight earlier today, and I'm not the least bit surprised to hear it. Dillian Whyte plays to the beat.
Marches to the beat.
Dillian Whyte marches to the beat of his own drum. It's always been that way. It's not about to change. Not ahead of this fight or any other fight for that matter. The build-up for this fight is very different than what we saw the first time out between Tyson Fury.
Deontay Wilder. All of their verbal sparring sessions.
One trying to one-up the other. Dillian Whyte will have none of it.
He doesn't care to mince words with Tyson Fury ahead of the fight.
Ahead of this weekend's contest, he stated, Tyson Fury says a lot of shit. His mouth's like a toilet. It just keeps on flushing and flushing and flushing. That's Tyson Fury. He just flushes any random shit that comes out of his mouth.
It was an interview conducted by way of BT Sport.
And that interview was made available for the fight fans to watch earlier this week. It almost gave you the sense that maybe now Dillian Whyte will play ball and try to help sell this fight, but I guess not. He didn't attend today's media workout.
You know how I always say that Tyson Fury, he's going to do what he wants, he won't stand for ceremony?
The exact same thing applies to Dillian Whyte. He won't stand for ceremony either. He marches to the beat of his own drum, the same as Tyson Fury. He stated everything he says, he being Tyson Fury, is contradicted. Why do a 12-week Spartan training camp for me? I'm a nobody. You're the greatest of all time. The new 6'9" Muhammad Ali, Tyson Frazier, and Foreman, all in one. So you're training so hard for me?
It's been an interesting build-up, to say the least.
The uncharacteristic silence from the otherwise outspoken Dillian Whyte, not to be confused with the uncharacteristic silence we saw from Deontay Wilder ahead of his third fight with Tyson Fury. In that situation, unlike this one, Deontay Wilder was humbled in the second fight.
Humbled in defeat.
You can chalk up Wilder's uncharacteristic silence ahead of his third fight with Tyson Fury to a man broken, a man being broken, his spirit having been broken, having fought Tyson Fury 2 times already and not being able to secure the W. That's what that uncharacteristic silence was. Whereas this, what we're seeing from Dillian Whyte, he hasn't fought Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury hasn't beaten him. What we're seeing from Dillian Whyte is a guy who's not going to play ball, a guy who's not going to cooperate. He's not given to the trash talk and mind games from Tyson Fury. Thus, he's not susceptible to them.
The build-up for this fight would be a lot bigger if Dillian would play ball.
I think we can all agree on that. I think it would have gone a long way, or would go a long way, to help sell this fight if you saw both guys in the same room mincing words with each other. But Dillian doesn't want that. What Dillian wants is violence. That's what he says. He says, I just want violence now, to be honest. I just want the violence to begin. I'm calm, I'm cool, but inside, I'm just raging. And violence, it's going to be off in my head.
What Frank and Bob want is for this to be the Tyson Fury show.
Where Tyson Fury, characteristically, gets to put on display his gift of gab, his silver tongue, his way with words, and his ability to work a crowd. That's what they want in order to help sell this fight, and Dillian Whyte, defiantly, is not giving them that satisfaction.
Fuck what you want.
Fuck him and his gift of gab.
I understand it, and I even think it adds something to the fight.
Dillian Whyte has nothing to lose. No O to protect. No unbeaten record to preserve. He's already been stopped once by Anthony Joshua and again by Alexander Povetkin. And ahead of this fight with Tyson Fury, this being Dillian Whyte's title shot, Dillian has nothing to lose. It's Tyson Fury.
Some people don't like that Dillian isn't playing ball.
Mostly Tyson Fury supporters who think he's just supposed to fall in line with whatever Tyson Fury, Frank Warren, and Bob Arum want, in spite of the trio making things more difficult than they had to be in order to negotiate this fight and get it over the line. Better still, there are those people, but Dillian Whyte doesn't give a shit about those people. He doesn't give a shit about Tyson Fury.
He won't stand for ceremony and fuck who don't like it.
This comes at the cost of the fight's build-up.
His demeanor and his silence has sparked my curiosity.
I just feel like it's given Dillian somewhat of an air of spontaneity ahead of this fight, the way you don't get to get in my head the way you got in Vladimir's or the way you got in Wilder's.
I'm not those guys.
I'm not going to play by your rules or anybody else's. Myself, as a spectator in this spectator sport, I have to admit, it makes things interesting.
In a unique way, it does.
$41 million fight, 94,000 expected to be in attendance, yet Dillian Whyte's demeanor towards the whole thing, he might as well be fighting your call.
I don't care about any of that. He won't stand for ceremony.
I wonder if that'll have any effect on the fight.